One of the great joys of SVA has been connecting to people like Jack. There's that combination of irrepressible Gen X energy and the wisdom of Solomon. And as Jack reflected, one of the opportunities and the privileges we've had in working with programs like AIM is supporting them in pretty practical ways: access to the capital and funding that they need, access to the talent that they need to help them grow high quality teams and boards, and to be very clear about the evidence of what they're doing. And for those of you, and many of you have, walk into the SVA foyer, that's what you see: capital, talent, evidence. They sit at the centre of pretty much everything that we've done, and they, in a very profound way, reflect our learnings over the last 12 years. 12 years of investing in social change through a range of things, and we've had a remarkable experience of doing that. We've backed over 40 high-quality social ventures, funded them with more than 45 million, and that's been drawn from over 1,000 that we've looked at. Our consulting practice has completed over 500 assignments with more than 300 clients. We've had the opportunity to drive interesting systems changing, risky. Not everything we've done has worked, but where it has, it's made a real difference. And as the Treasurer touched on, some pioneering impact investing projects like the social benefit bonds, like Good Start. So the great privilege of that 12 years since SVA started is that we've had the opportunity to access remarkable talent in the organisation, but networks that are reflected in the audience tonight. And it's been to us that alliance of partners, of funders, of thought leaders and doers, we're all about the doing, across the sectors who share our view that things can be done differently and they actually need to be done better. Now, through that experience, we've actually learnt a huge amount. And while we're not a think tank, we do actually try and think hard about the issues and the consequences of what we see in practice. And we think particularly hard about why it is that despite a generation of economic growth, and in many cases quite significant funding growth for social purpose programs, the data tells us that we haven't made much progress in what to us is still the core moral and economic issue we face in this country. And that's this, that many Australians are living in continuing cycles of exclusion and they can't participate fully in the community. We recognise there's some contested space in this, but let's focus on what we think are two unequivocal pieces of data. And they show the following: that for a child who grows up in a bottom 25% postcode, on average, all of the data will tell us that that kid is on average likely to be 2.5 to 3 years behind a kid who's privileged and fortuitous circumstances to grow up in a top 25% postcode. We care about cradle to career. The employment outcomes are similarly challenging. More than 1.6 million Australians who live in a cycle of and underemployment, bouncing in and out of welfare. They don't permanently emerge. So surely, as a country that prides itself on the notion of the fair go, we're capable, as the Treasurer reflected, of actually doing better than that. And so we think the real focus for us must be, how do we build smart, sustainable ways of accessing capital and funding for the right programs? How do we ensure that we have the right talent to build social purpose organisations and change programs that are genuinely making a difference to close that opportunity gap? In short, how is it that we create an efficient capital market for social purpose outcomes? Because to us at the moment, it just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. In too many cases, we have funding by heart, not head. We have funders obsessed with process, as the Treasurer diagnosed, and not results and outcomes. We frequently have very limited funding for what I think to everybody in this room should be the most obvious of beneficiaries: well-run programs and organisations with a track record of results that need support and basic funding of administration to do more of what they do well. That funding is not always regularly available, far from it. We also think very narrowly about where the funding comes from. We tend never to think about accessing funding for social purpose from actually what's the biggest source of funding around, the $1.85 trillion superannuation market. If it doesn't come from government or known philanthropy sources, we think it doesn't exist. We think this has to change. And our genuine belief, which is informed by practical examples of what in SVA lexicon we call the bright spots of what investment in social change means is that we can genuinely create a much more efficient social purpose capital market, and we can tap significant pools of additional capital to transform what funding's available. And so tonight is really in the spirit of a call to arms about how we've got to change that. We think this change is the product of four things happening, and they're actually quite connected. The first one is pretty straightforward. We have to be bold. We have to be brave. We think this is actually a dysfunctional market, and when markets are seriously dysfunctional, you've got to be prepared to take risks and prove what's possible and galvanise actually quite different behaviour. We've had our share of failures at SVA, but we've not been shy of experimenting. And the truth is our bravest and most successful experiments, things like Good Start, for example, have been partnerships where there's been partners from across the sectors, each with serious skin and serious funding in the game. Second, we have to be very clear about what we want. Our experience tells us way too many social purpose organisations are poor at tracking and often even explaining what outcomes they want. And in truth, that's a problem compounded by lazy or dumb funders who don't ask the hard and right questions. 3, we have to bring mainstream funders into the game. And that includes the industry and superannuation funds, including particularly self-managed super funds, and I'll come back to that. At the risk of being rude, the institutions are actually typically Luddites on this in embracing any new form of investment class, and I say that, and there's some private equity colleagues of mine going back a couple of decades. It was very hard raising private equity in the 80s and 90s, and because institutions don't embrace new asset classes, 10 years later they were losing their jobs if they weren't prepared to do that. Now, what we have to do is find smart ways to accelerate the pickup of impact investing, because I think what deals like Good Start have demonstrated is that they've missed the opportunity to invest in a 12% return business because they're too conservative and they don't get it. Yet they will, like they did with private equity. 4, we need political leadership, and Treasurer, we're really appreciative of the opportunity we've had to engage here. The big funder, as I'll come to, is clearly government in a lot of this, and where change is happening, it's driven by political leaders who get the need to take risks, be clear about outcomes, and use the soapbox that leadership and political leadership is about to prosecute that case. A pioneering risk-taking investment like social benefit bonds happened here because of the political leadership shown by the government, and we need more of that around the country. I wanted to give a bit of context on the thinking and framework behind all this, because it's something we've kind of been mulling over at SVA, and I've been mulling over for a long time. And it's actually a story about a personal investment decision that highlights what I think are some of the critical issues that sit behind efficient and inefficient capital allocation. Now, while capital allocation in the business world is not perfect, capital generally flows based on common metrics of performance, and how and why this happens sheds some important light on the key themes of the narrative tonight. I've been a long-term investor in Wesfarmers. With my private equity background, I've always liked the way they think about capital allocation. It's an organisation that's been clear about return targets. They have a track record of high-quality, stable management and succession planning. So when they looked in 2007 to acquire the Coles failing retail chain, and while I don't spend a lot of time in supermarkets, even I knew how badly Coles was run then. Those with a memory for corporate history will recall that was a pretty controversial, pretty high-priced acquisition. And the way Wesfarmers decided to fund that was with a renounceable rights issue, which basically gave investors the right to buy more shares in the business. I had no hesitation in our family ponying up to invest and buy more shares in Wesfarmers. Why did I do that? When I think about it, it was all of the things that I was reflecting. And if you actually look at what happened with that, they did exactly what they'd consistently done. They hired a globally regarded retail executive in Ian McLeod. The turnaround from Coles took place not overnight, but over 5 years. I recently looked at the Wesfarmers results. Coles contributed, I think, north of 40% of their earnings. And in that 8-year period, the organisation has grown from a market cap of $14 billion to $48 billion. As I said, while the corporate world's far from perfect, it actually generally does a pretty good job of allocating capital. And I reckon that Wesfarmers is not a bad example of that. Think about it. They access capital based on a track record of hitting clearly defined targets over a long period of time. Underpinning that was the company's consistent ability to find and identify high-quality management talent to drive that performance. Capital, talent, evidence. And to us, this is pretty straightforward. These are the underpinnings of a virtuous loop in which successful performance is rewarded and equally underperformance punished. And of course, over time, commercial businesses that don't achieve targets will struggle to access capital and many fail because of that. So for illustration, let me flip gears and contrast how badly we've done in capital allocation in what everybody in this room would see as a vital social purpose area of education, clearly a key driver of productivity. In that area, our SVA colleague and friend Ben Jensen from the Grattan Institute, formerly from Grattan, tells us that despite a 45% increase in real spending in education in the decade from 2000, all of the key performance indicators around OECD PISA levels, around the traction and opportunity for those in the bottom 25% to achieve have at best gone sideways and backwards. Can I put it to you that if education was a division of Wesfarmers, it's highly likely the board would make appropriate decisions to get better outcomes. Now, while of course we accept the challenge that defining performance expectations and target outcomes in the social purpose world is different than business metrics of cash flow and return on shareholders' funds, we must address what it takes to do this better. Because if we don't, we'll be having the same discussion in 20 years. And in the education space alone, the Grattan numbers would suggest to us that we've wasted a potential annual GDP contribution of 0.7% a year. The maths on that is $70 billion worth of wasted productivity. What I wanted to do tonight is run through what we think's not working and how we fix it with that lens of capital and funding flows. And I'm summarising a more detailed article from the SVA Consulting Quarterly. Jack, it does still live. We produce it quarterly. We're very reliable like that. We hit our targets, mate. But you can pick that up and digest it at your leisure on the way out. Now, the structure of this argument works in three parts. First is a quick look at the structure of the current funding market for social purpose, really as a vehicle for identifying where are the bottlenecks, where are the dysfunctions. Then we want to move to, in SVA language, where are the bright spots? You know, our belief is that we learn from that which works and we try and replicate and scale that, as Jack highlighted. And then I want to close with what it is that we each have to do in partnership to drive the change that we think must happen. Let me clarify first a couple of important definitional issues. First, we use consistently the definition of a social purpose sector. I think it's time we labelled the most important sector in the country, one I've been proud to work in for 12 years and want to continue to service and support for what it is rather than what it doesn't do. So it is social purpose. Second, when we talk about capital, we mean quite a broad definition of capital and funding as applied to organisations and social purpose programs. And this quick graphic highlights that. So at one end, on your left-hand side, you'll have super quality programs like AIM. Jack accesses funding from philanthropic strategic grant makers. He doesn't, although I'm sure we'll get to it, have a revenue generating model in the business. If you flip to the other side of the chart, you see an organisation like Good Start, which is an $800 million social enterprise, which has a sustainable funding model, uses that surplus for social purpose. And there's hybrid space in the middle where the connection of clear financial returns, a granular quantification of social returns lends itself to a lot of work we've done around social benefit bonds, around social enterprise. Now I want to turn to the structure of the market and try and illustrate where the funding's coming from in aggregate terms and what the consequences of that are. This is just using an example, but it highlights some pretty critical points. This looks at the sources of funding to schools, and you can see here the dominance of government funding. $11 billion of federal government funding, $33+ billion of state and territories funding, and a lot of that comes in the form of tied grants from the federal government. The philanthropic giving is of the order of 300 to 400 million. Now, the maths on that are pretty tiny. That's about 1% of the pool. So, and this picture obviously varies across different sectors, but broadly we can't escape the significance of government funding around this, and it has consequences. And first, and the Treasurer picked up on some of these points, the first challenge of this is that, and this has got a lot of currency lately, short-term political cycles really, really challenge the right long-term focus. And I think the well-documented reality, and in Australia the maths are, the average federal post-World War II electoral cycle I think is about 2 years and 7 months. Now what we know is that serious investment in social change requires patience and a long-term commitment. And it's interesting in the work that we've seen in employment and education, it's unequivocal that the jurisdictions that have changed the profile and performance of outcomes have done so with a patient long-term approach, doing things consistently over a decade or more. So we need to recognise that. Second, and while this is not unique to Australia, a system of federal government does create some real alignment problems and issues. And I think we've seen that writ large in the challenges of getting any agreement on the focus and outcomes with the protracted and barely implemented post-Gonski reforms. And I think that's become something of a poster child example of the tangled debate across the federal-state divide. Third, and I think everybody in this room has probably had different experiences of this, but government funding really does frequently obsess with process and not outcomes. Now, we get the understandable requirement for probity and accountability around taxpayer funding, but the obsession with process, a measurement of what we call busyness indicators, activities rather than outcomes, the requirements of acquittal of funding paperwork can be extraordinarily demanding. I remember vividly an early lesson on this when SVA was about 4 or 5 years old. We'd been successful in accessing funding from a government-funded social enterprise program, and the key outcome focus of that was jobs generation for the long-term unemployed. That was the real target. My colleague Kevin Robbie, who has much deeper experience with government than me, told me that when we got that funding, we'd have to get an additional 2 to 3 day a week resource to manage the acquittal and reporting requirements, none of which to us seemed to have anything but accidental correlation to the key long-term outcomes. And I was staggered. I didn't think that was right. Why would we need another resource? We'd built something of a reputation for being clear around accountability metrics to some of our key strategic philanthropists. But that's what we had to do. That's what we had to do. So these are real challenges. I wanted to turn now more specifically to the philanthropic sector. And this is, again, quite a high-level picture, but it gives an indication that the total level of philanthropic giving is about $7.7 billion. Now, a lot of that includes church plate retail funding. There's $2 billion worth of tax-deductible funding, and courtesy of the growth in prescribed ancillary funds, about $250 million from that source, which is great. But, you know, I have to say that our experience about whether chunks of that are truly strategic is at best questionable. And while I've heard a lot of criticism from the philanthropic sector ripping into government for the sort of reasons I've just expressed, we think the truth is there's not a huge amount of strategic and outcomes-focused funding from the philanthropy world. It's interesting, we've got a partner relationship with New Philanthropy Capital in the UK, and they polled major strategic UK foundations and philanthropists. What they found was that 38% did not use outcomes as a basis for their allocations. Now, we haven't done the survey in Australia, but I think our consulting colleagues would be staggered if it's any different. So I think, in truth, there's a little bit of fantasy going on there. And we need to be honest in recognising the reality that much of this funding is what I've come to call spray and pray philanthropy. It's relatively small in one-off amounts, it's fragmented, it's heart and not head-based, with little homework or clear addressing of need. It's the, you know, mate, you take a table at my charity dinner and I'll take a table at yours, we'll have a few reds, we'll buy a couple of charity items that we stick in the downstairs dunny, and that's it. You know, we really have got to be capable of better. But through all of this, the way we encapsulate a particular problem for us is something we've come to call the zone of funding disconnect, and this is a graveyard. What this describes, I think, is the failure to apply sensible strategic and business disciplines to philanthropy. And of all the bottlenecks we've identified, this is what causes, I think, most frustration and grief. And this is a bit personal because I spent a life in private equity where you chase organisations with the growth potential of Jack and AIM, and I might say SVA as well, organisations where they were meeting targets, they were run by high quality people, and they needed to capital to support their maturation and next steps of growth. Yet in the new social purpose game that I've been playing with SVA, organisations hit a roadblock, and this graphic captures indicatively where that is. So a lot of social purpose organisations can get set up with chunks of friends and family, philanthropic funding, but the dead zone from kind of 2 million to 10 million, they really struggle to access scalable funding. And we've done a bit of homework on this. Most of the relatively small number of large-scale social purpose organisations in Australia are typically 60 to 80% dependent on government funding. Now, that's not ideal either. So this zone of funding disconnect, we think, is a critical issue and deserves some attention. I wanted to, you know, there's a psychology around this that I wanted to tease out. You know, there's a risk, I was saying to somebody before, there's a risk that I turn into a grumpy old man about some of this, but, you know, having spent 12 years in this market, we need to call some dysfunctional behaviours here, and there's some stereotypical thinking from the funders that I think causes this that we need to kind of put on the table. So we have the startup funder, and what the startup funder says, and we had a few startup funders in our first year at SVA, which was great. Looks like you, Jack. Very cool. And the startup funder says, we love what you're doing, we funded it, and I naively at the end of our first year, when in truth, and I'll say this carefully because I've got some beloved founding directors of SVA in the audience, I had not a lot of idea of what SVA was going to do on day one. I think we'd worked it out a little bit more by the end of year one. But the startup funders that I went back to at the end of the first year said, we're off to do the next new thing. And my thought bubble is, really? I mean, would you do that in the business world? Just now that we're working out what the hell we're doing and what we're trying to achieve, you're buggering off to do the next new thing? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Then we have the strategic funder, also a very cool dude. I should say, Kat, where did you get these pictures from there? I better have a disclaimer. All characters appearing in this work are fictitious. Any resemblance to SVA funders living or dead is purely coincidental. Glad I've got that out of the road. I married a lawyer. I need to put that on the table. So the strategic funder typically will fund for 3 years, which is great, and there are very few of them around, but struggle to go beyond that. And again, my thought bubble is fantastic that you've been with us for 3 years, but why would you not think about funding allocation in the same way as I've thought about a 12-year investment in Wesfarmers? As long as they keep hitting their targets and doing well, I'll keep stumping up family funding to support what they're doing. Does that not make sense? And finally, and this is probably my pet peeve, it's the audit cop funder. And the conversation with the audit cop funder goes a little bit like this, which is, we like your work, you're doing interesting stuff, but we want to fund the kids and the programs. We're not funding administration. And I think, really? You would invest in a business that has no marketing, no strategy, no finance? I spent a life in private equity. There is no way I would have gone to a board of the calibre that I reported to without all of those things being evident in spades. You know, so what's going on here? You know, my thought bubble's saying, do you think people drop out of trees to work at an organisation like SVA? Are they so filled with the bliss of working in the social purpose sector that they'll do it for nothing? And if there's anything that sits at the very heart of SVA, it's been our capacity to get fantastic quality people who believe in what we're doing, and yes, they do need to be paid, and yes, they do need career paths. And while they're paid a lot less than many of them would be in the commercial world, if we don't get out of our own road in recognising this reality, we are doing the sector a massive, massive disservice. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. But the truth is, it is this failure to consistently and reliably fund high-performing social purpose organisations that's an utter nonsense. And you can see that, again, this is overseas data, but I think hugely relevant. Many of you will have seen the Dan Pallotta TEDx talk. I must have received it from about 50 people. But what he talks about is exactly that point of the need to fund capacity funding. And the US, think of the scale of the US, their zone of funding disconnect because of the bigger size of the market probably kicks in at about $50 million, not the 2 to 10 that I'm positing in the Australian market. But I think this data is utterly compelling. What it says is that over that 40-year period, more than 46,000 for-profit organisations, because they've accessed a cocktail of venture and mezzanine and equity, capital and debt funding, have blown through that $50 million barrier, but only 144 social purpose organisations. And I have absolutely no doubt that if you had the data in Australia, the same thing would be reflected. What I want to do, so I guess that's a fairly grim picture of where the problems are, but we are optimists at SVA, and genuinely so, because we've had the chance to work with extraordinary organisations and to do some things that are bright spots of how this can change. And I wanted to use this frame of reference around capital, talent and evidence, because I think these are the key levers if we're going to do this better. If my colleague Duncan Peppercorn, who founded our consulting business, was here, he'd rightly say all of this starts with evidence. You can't think about allocating capital until you're clear about the evidence of what works, and I think that's absolutely right. So while we recognise that determining social purpose outcomes can be really hard, we have to understand that we must be crystal clear about outcomes, and that really is the start point. And we think actually there are quite a few emerging examples of good practice which provide the sort of precedents we want to see around change and efficiency. And the common denominator, which again the Treasurer reflected, which is very encouraging, is a mix of the following: measurable, long-term social purpose outcomes, and where relevant, clear financial targets. So that game of patience. Where are things changing? I think governments globally are starting to click into this. I had an opportunity last year to meet with the New Zealand Deputy Prime Minister Bill English, and it was actually a visit spawned because of the New Zealand government's fascination with the social benefit bonds, a measure of how they're thinking about targeted outcome measurement. But the reciprocal of the opportunity to share our experience and scar tissue around developing those was that I got a privileged opportunity to look more closely at some fairly significant public sector reform that they are undertaking. And what you'll see if you have a look at the site is there's a really clear, brave, long-term articulation of better outcomes and targets in 6 core areas that include things like reducing long-term welfare dependence, supporting vulnerable children, and there was a recent article that Cass Wilkinson wrote in The Australian on this a couple of weeks ago. I think they're really having a crack at that. I think in Australia there is a laudable and bipartisan support for the Close the Gap measures. It's not perfect, but it's a long-dated recognition that in one of the most challenging areas of the social economy, we've got to be brave and define 5 and 10-year targets and express what's working and what isn't. These are good things. These are really good things. And in the experience of SVA itself, one of the core parts of the SVA consulting practice is that we've done over 100 social return on investment analyses. And that's a very powerful tool for asking hard and pointy questions about programs, whether they work, what they cost, what outcomes they're driving. And I think it's really encouraging that there are organisations who value that, social purpose organisations and funders increasingly saying, we actually want to see this as evidence of what's working and what's not. So there is some change on the evidence front. Let me come to this challenging issue of the zone of funding disconnect and paint a, I think, slightly more optimistic picture than I might have given you the impression exists. I think the fact that that Pilotta video, which when I last looked at it had north of 2 million views, is actually a pretty encouraging sign that this is getting traction as well it should. And one of the prouder moments, I think, for SVA in the early days, and we've tried to make capacity funding sexy because we recognise how important it is that some of the leading corporate foundations, Macquarie, AMP, have started to pick that up. I think there are strategic corporate and individual philanthropists who get that and are doing that. And there was also a really interesting data point we came across through our consulting team. The Edna McConnell Clark Foundation in the US, one of the multi-billion-dollar strategic foundations, did a major review of their giving over a 2-decade period. And one of their conclusions was that the smartest thing they could do would be to re-up, in private equity terms, reinvest in those businesses, those social purpose organisations that had done well. And it meant them going back to organisations, some of which they'd stopped funding because their 3-year strategic funding had run out. And they did that in partnership. It was with the US Government Social Innovation Fund, and that was actually a $120 million partnership funding play to back organisations like AIM, like the Beacon Foundation, who we work with, like SVA. We thought that was really cool and really powerful. And in fact, the Obama administration has done some pretty interesting and constructive things in that space. And to us, if you think about that program, that fund was called the True North program, you know, that's it sounds a lot like my investment decision to increase the commitment to Westfarm. Is it not common sense to keep backing those things which continue to perform? I mean, to us, that should be the easiest and most rational decision to make. And now let me come to some of the bright spots of capital supply and pick up some of these points around how we tap capital in different ways. And I think there's a huge amount to be excited about in this regard, and it was great to look at the Treasurer's excitement, and we really hope that's sustained. And I think the Good Start transaction, which raised $165 million, has certainly been recognised as a bit of a game changer in the Australian market. The sort of scale and profit associated with that, steered for social purpose, has really proved to the naysayers, and there were plenty of them around when we were looking at the transaction, that actually it is possible to run things like that with business discipline for social purpose. And it's a source of some collective pride for all those involved that we've repaid virtually all the debt 3 years ahead of schedule. And the throw weight of Good Start around early learning, pivotal area in the social economy, has really started to kick in. There's equally a lot of movement at the big end of town. We were delighted to have as a special guest at an SVA Leadership Council dinner last year Sir Ron Cohen, who's a global guru of impact investing. He heads the Group of 8 G8 Impact Advisory Task Force. And Ron's a real proselytiser for the sorts of things around social benefit bonds, but scale. You know, he's with the support at the most heavyweight level. I mean, he launched that G8 Impact Task Force with the British Prime Minister David Cameron. He's got serious access. And what he's putting on the radar is we need to think about this as a scalable multi-billion dollar asset class, as it should be. And we've heard about the power on a local scale of what actually happens when you think clearly about financial returns connected to social returns with the social benefit bonds. And what's exciting to us, my colleague Ian Lemont, who heads our impact investing team, very significantly on the back of work that's been done in this state, is in conversations with governments and treasurers around the country about how we do more of that. So we think these emerging bright spots of smart and creative capital and funding allocation connected to clear outcome measurement are the bright spots. And our challenge in partnership across the sectors is what is it that we can do to turn this into a bright system where we have truly efficient capital allocation across the entire social purpose world. And our strong belief is that everybody's got a part to play in this. There's no silver bullet one funder solution to this. If you're a social purpose organisation, our encouragement is be prepared to be explicit and brave in measuring your outcomes. And most especially, actually tell the truth when things don't work as you wanted. You might be pleasantly surprised at how appreciative funders are at honest feedback on that, and we don't see enough of that. And for what it's worth, our relationship with one of SVA's most significant and strategic funders, Bob Bryan, started with a program in the area of aged care that he and we wanted to scale and grow. What we realised after 1 year was that that was not going to be possible. The program worked okay, but it just wasn't scalable. And I think he greatly appreciated the transparency with which that reality was communicated. If you're a social purpose investor, our plea is use your business brain. If you want to make a real difference as opposed to practicing spray and pray philanthropy, use the same energy, intellect and focus that we don't doubt you used to the process of building the wealth, and apply that intellect and focus and energy to contributing. And that's basic simple stuff. You know, be prepared to ask the hard and reasonable questions of social purpose organisations. Ask what would define success for your organisation. What's your track record of getting high quality people? What's their track record? Do you keep good people around? We really should be doing that. I think the other part of it is be prepared to be a brave impact investor. The mainstream industry funds, for understandable reasons, are going to be conservative, but you can get pretty decent financial returns out of your self-managed super fund with emerging impact investing products. I'll speak for our family's financials. I think Jen and I would have been quite happy to get 12% across the rest of the portfolio, the 12% we got in Good Start. So we think the idea that you can actually get reasonable returns and do some social good, these things are not mutually exclusive. And if you're a government leader and in the public service, help us help you. Help us help you. Forgive me for sounding like Jerry Maguire, but I think one of the deep learning journeys for me at SVA is how difficult it can be to get governments and the public service, for reasons I now understand a little better, to take the risk necessary to do new and different things. It's bloody hard. And I remember particularly vividly the very high quality senior bureaucrat we were dealing with in the last throes of the Good Start negotiation. So to close this $165 million deal, the missing piece was $15 million of debt funding from the federal government, and we really needed it. And I remember him taking me aside when we were at 5 minutes to midnight, and he said, "Michael, do you know that it would have been so much easier for you to get that money if you'd applied for a grant?" And I thought, that is nuts. That is nuts. I mean, we've just paid that debt back 3 years earlier than anticipated. But I now understand why that piece of debt was so hard. It literally had to be signed off at the highest levels of government. Why? Because it was different, and the public sector and government struggle with different. So it's the combination of political leadership. I think there are some examples of that, the stuff we saw in New Zealand, evident with SBBs here, in concert with what, forgive the private equity analogy, but it's a bias to complete the transaction. You have to take risks and you have to close deals. You've got to take risks, and we need to see that happening. Enough of the kind of capital markets theory. I wanted to close with something that is a kind of a bit of a personal reminder, actually, of what I think this is about. I grew up in country Victoria in a town called Moore, which has a population of 17,000, and Moore was in the newspapers for the wrong reasons. Those of you might recall there was an open cut fire that went on for a long period of time. The Moore I grew up in did have a sense of community, but I was at school as a proud product of the state education system there, with kids of enormous potential who needed the support that would have made a difference to their lives, kids that I know had the capacity to do incredibly well, but in different ways were let down, sometimes by the school, sometimes by their families, sometimes by their communities. I remember particularly with great affection my Indigenous mate Theo, who was a cracker athlete, and Theo was the pivot, beautiful natural runner. He was the pivot in a 4x400 metre relay team that won a bronze medal that I was proud to be part of in the under-12 state Little Athletics Championships. 3.5 years after I stood arm in arm with Theo on the dais, he was in the juvenile justice system in Tirana for hot wiring cars, and having occasionally picked up Theo on the way to training, I can see that there wasn't a lot happening at home, and I was at Moore Park Primary School with him that would have given him the opportunity to achieve what I knew was enormous potential. My confident bet is that if a program like AIM was in Moore Park Primary School, that might have made a difference. that might have made a real difference. And in fact, our first house in Morwell is just on the left frame of the picture, 12 Grandview Grove. We were 300 yards from the open cut, and this seemed like a picture that provides a pretty powerful metaphor. That fire was left burned for a long period of time before the Victorian health authorities did much about it. And I think that speaks to us of the burning social fire that has existed for a generation in Morwell and other communities like it, where kids of potential and promise who need a hand up, not a hand out, are not given the full opportunity to achieve. I don't think that's morally consistent with what most of us believe, to sit on our backsides and to keep watching the fire. And it's also dumb economically, and we pay the productivity costs for a generation of lost talent and potential, which we allow to slip between the cracks. So I wanted to close and reflect that I think through the gift of the 12 years of experience we've had in the team at SVA and through the networks that we've been privileged to work with, I feel like we're much clearer about what our role is in building a more efficient social purpose capital market. We've made mistakes, but I think in some pretty significant ways we've proved what difference we can make when we work effectively in partnership and pull those capital and talent and evidence levers together. And I really wanted to warmly thank the many, many people in this room who've contributed to that, and hopefully will continue to do so. As most of you know, we are truly delighted to have an outstanding incoming Chief Executive in Rob Koskar coming on board, and I very much look forward to supporting Rob and our super quality leadership team in a very different way to help take the next steps of building that efficient market. I hope my continuing passion for this work is obvious, but I do look forward to supporting it on a slightly more flexible basis, and I particularly and publicly wanted to thank my wife Jenny and promise to her that I will be a bit more flexible. What we've been able to do with the generous support of people in this room is build the first steps of that investing in social change. That capacity building for us is about the throw weight we need to engage with government to get the kind of scale of change that we need. We won't be shy of asking you, as we're typically not, for your support, because we truly are of the strong belief that if we can use that to work in partnership, we can change the way the country works. Thank you.